I think what a lot of people, especially business owners and entrepreneurs, they don't want to get on the content train just because it feels daunting. Do I even know what I'm talking about? What am I going to talk about? What's interesting to people? Where do I get started? And that's why it's really good to have people like us, for example, who you can come in and be like, here's everything we do. And then it's like, well, let's create a strategy. Let's create some angles, right? I went to high school with Alex Hormozy, and obviously he's like huge in the content game. Didn't believe in it at all until he read something about Kylie Jenner being super duper rich and being 21 or something like that. And he was like, okay, well, that was all through the fact that she's got all of this content out there, right? And now him and his wife have blown up their businesses. And I think they're perfect case studies of, hey, test stuff. If you watch his videos from when he first started to where he's at now, they're completely different. If you watch the episodes for our oldest clients, they were not great, and now they're much better. And I'm sure in a year from now, they're gonna continue to get better, but you just gotta get started.
Leila, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Lewis. So excited to see you. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. The studio looks great. This is your studio.
Yes, this is our second one.
An awesome layout. Yeah, there's a few studios in here. Like the long couch, I think this is gonna come out looking really good on YouTube, so.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to be with you.
Yeah, lots for us to discuss today. I think what's usually most helpful, because hosts always do an introduction and butcher it, is for just you to tell us a little bit about the businesses that you have and kind of how PS Creative exists and what the parts are.
Okay, so I started 13 years ago when I was 22, fresh out of college in Washington, D.C., and the company started as PS, but we were really more focused in a political space. We were doing a lot of digital fundraising. That was kind of the wave of putting digital marketing into fundraising. If you remember tactics, you're younger, but before then, everything was really paper and phone. And while those things still obviously exist, the wave kind of with the Obama era was digital, digital, digital. How do we utilize this to make more of an impact? So I got to be a part of that. We were also doing live events for politicians, and we worked with normal people too, but that was really how things started for the company. And finally, I was about to turn 30, and I said, I've got to get out of DC. I'm going to move back home to Orange County, California, and, keep the business, but let's just see what changes. And I ended up coming out on a business trip to Arizona on a whim. Never been in my whole life. And I was like, this is actually paradise. I'm going to move here. And I didn't really know anybody, but within 4 months, I packed up everything, came out to Arizona, and basically rebuilt the business from scratch, because all of my clients back east obviously stayed back east. And I would go back once a month to kind of keep up appearances, but I was really focused on what can I do here. And that's when the business really started to shift. So present day, fast forward, we're in 2024. That was back in 2018. We were really heavy in event planning, mixing digital with events, like live in-person events. 2020 decimated that. And we were like, well, we need to think on our feet. What can we do to keep meeting people despite everything being closed down? I said, let's open up a podcast studio in our office, because that's a great way to be able to get people to come in, share their stories, network in a controlled environment, and people will feel comfortable. There we go. So that's what we did. And we didn't really know what we were doing, but figured it out. Trial and error, kept getting better, kept finding better talent to help optimize the process. And then a couple years ago, moved into this current space that we're in. Opened up our first studio down the hall, which you've been in. You've done a couple of interviews. And then I would say 6-7 months ago, got this space here. As you can see, a little bit of a different vibe. And yeah, so two sides of the business. We've got digital marketing. We've got web development, SEO, paid ads, social media content creation. And then the other side is podcast and content creation and commercial video. So obviously those two things oftentimes go hand in hand for businesses. And so it's a nice mixture, but they do kind of have their own separate arenas as well.
I think when I first connected the dots, because I first met you just looking on Google for
a studio
in town. I lived nearby. I lived really close at the time, actually. And I was like, this is right there. And then I think I also connected the dots that I recognized a couple of the interviews that were here. Mm-hmm. I think I found it specifically from a referral, because when I saw that interview with Dickie Bush and Dan Coe.
That's right.
And I saw that interview and I asked them where they did it, because I saw them when they were in town. And I was like, where do you guys do that? Because the one other time I did my in-person podcast in Arizona, I went all the way to Phoenix. It was a whole drive. And it was, they did well too, but it was way less convenient. And I was like, there's no way those guys took a 30-minute drive for something. And then they told me about this place. And then I thought it was cool too, because like I like put out an interview a few weeks later, and it's like, oh, it's the same studio, and maybe like some of the same audience recognized it. And anyway, I thought was so interesting because I didn't connect the dots that like you actually had a different business. I just thought this was the entire business.
Yeah.
But so many of our customers, and for so many businesses, acquiring customers when you are in marketing services, which is just kind of a broad spectrum, like every business that has money and wants to make more of it eventually comes to the conclusion that they should be doing more marketing, or they could be doing better marketing. And half of the battle there, unless you have a hyper specific pitch, like we help this really narrow set of businesses do this really niche specific thing, and we're only good at that. A lot of it's just people knowing who you are and having a genuine relationship and seeing you as a normal, smart person. So the studio is such an interesting and effective way, hopefully, for making those connections.
It definitely has been. I mean, it's led to us meeting so many incredible people. But then what we do that's so different from a lot of other studios is we've got people like you who find us, walk in, book a session, and then take your files and go. But the bread and butter is that we've got clients who want to start a show or already have, but they want to do it at a much higher level. They don't have time. They're busy CEOs. They're busy business owners. And they say, I need a one-stop shop. So our clients literally book their studio time with us. They book their guests. They send their guests an intake form that connects to our system. Their guest fills that out. They show up, they record, then everything else is handled from that point forward. All of the digital design, the assets, the collateral, the editing, you name it, even the post communications to their guests to be able to share those assets, et cetera, is handled through our team. So it's optimizing the process because I think a lot of people know that there's a lot of value in A, creating content, or B, having a podcast. They just don't have that time to sit there and become really good at it. And when you're piecemealing and you've got an editor over here and you've got an audio person over here and then this person cuts the clips, it becomes chaotic and you're spending so much time even managing these people that you start and then you instantly stop. So we've created a really turnkey process, and those are our big clients that A, pay the bills and keep the business afloat, but B, like they've helped us optimize the process to the highest degree. And we get to meet really cool people because they have them coming directly into our living room, essentially.
Yeah. I think one of the, when you first start out in business, you have so many like juvenile beliefs that are about how things work. And like, all of my team and myself included, we all did software engineering in school. So we're like, the only valuable things are hard things. It's kind of like our belief. We're like, it's only useful if it's like really complicated and difficult. It's like, here's this really hard thing. Whereas like podcasting, I think, for example, like, the high production value stuff, having all the right equipment and like what we're doing here is difficult, and that does require some domain expertise. But for like the minimum podcast of just like getting a Zoom meeting and publishing that to an RSS feed, like that's quite simple.
Yes.
But the details of just doing something basic and almost boring sometimes, just monotonously and consistently, like that is a whole other aspect of what's valuable in business, is just doing something that's just frankly like annoying and frustrating and just tiring. And you're just like, I just don't want to deal with this. Like I used to think the only thing was just, I have to sell hard stuff, but it's like, no, there's like just basic stuff that people need and just want someone reliable and trustworthy to make it easy for them. Yeah,
100%. I think that we're definitely living proof of that. But within the business, through all the different steps it takes to produce an episode, if you ask my producer, you ask my creative director, we're doing annoying things literally every single day. But those little annoying things are what create consistent workflows and then end up like how we can deliver a really high quality product to a customer. Not all of it's brain damage, don't get me wrong. Like it's not doing software coding, but it does take, doing monotony day in and day out.
I mean, the point is it's things that you should not be doing as the business owner day to day.
Ideally, no.
Exactly. So specifically, what are some of the, you said a minute ago that you think like not everyone should have a podcast, but what are some of the benefits that your clients see from the type of content that you assist them with producing?
There's so many benefits. Honestly, the first and foremost is that your network expands so drastically. So you go from being an impact of one, having a really good intimate conversation like I'm having here with you, but then someone else sees that, right? Even only 300 people see something, right? Say it's a small show, you're just getting started. That's still 300 people who did not know you before that now know you. But then you share this on your platform. I take all of these clips, I share it on my platform, and now you have all this exposure to my network of thousands upon thousands of people that otherwise might not have ever heard of you, met you, understood what your expertise is. So it's a really mutually beneficial situation for both the guest and for the host when you look at it in that reciprocal like ecosystem. And then secondly, it's so difficult, and I know I could do a better job of it myself, but if you have a business and no one knows you have a business, do you really have a business, right? So the more you're out there and able to talk about, you know, the things that are relevant and going on in the industry and showcasing that you are an industry leader, the easier it is to be able to acquire clients. And then I would say third is client acquisition. Everybody jumps straight to, I just want to sponsor, I want all these sponsors, I want to monetize. And it's like, that's usually the last thing to come out of all the benefits. And it's great. We've got plenty of monetized shows, but the three things that come before that, I'd say, are the most important and most effective. And that's also why for our major clients, you sign a year-long contract, because we don't want people who start off with like stars in their eyes, think they're going to be famous in 2 months, and then they're frustrated. Why am I not, you know, I don't have 1 million followers. It's like, that's not reality. Nobody starts and then bam, has 1 million followers the next day. But.
Exactly. I think we're also kind of in the same business where most of our clients are existing businesses, and what we're helping them with ultimately with the content we're producing is just acquiring leads. And people very quickly, like, something happens in their mind and like the allure of becoming famous or whatever like takes over. And it's like, that's not why we're here. It's like, we're not here to create media companies for media company's sake. It's like, we're creating this content to assist you with finding customers. It's like, you can play the advertiser game of like, okay, we're going to start your podcast if you get 10,000 downloads per episode and this many views per, it's like the money there is just not good. You're like, or, you know, this thing that you sell for like $5,000 a month, what if we help you sell like a couple extra of those every single month with this versus getting, and you're going to make, you know, 10 times as much money than you would if you got 20,000 views on every episode.
So I have the best story about this that I don't even think I've told you this. So you came in second or third time here in our studio, and you were interviewing a guy named Andre. And Andre only does interviews in person, which I love. I was like, oh my God, this guy's speaking my language. Anyways, my producer wasn't there that night, so I was the one actually behind the camera, which rarely ever happens these days. And you guys had such a good conversation, but it's when I learned that you had just started your email business. And I was like, oh my gosh, I know clients that need that, and we don't want to offer it, first off. And then second of all, he's talking about his company that he built from the ground up, ListKit. And I was like, oh, wow, I've used Zoom Info before. I hated it. And there's so many different ways that we could use ListKit for any client, and including our own business. So fast forward, I email you, I become a customer with your ghostwriting agency, love it. 2 months ago, signed up with ListKit, did the whole done for you system so that they can start emailing out things and getting that whole ecosystem rolling. That's
a
not
whole other nightmare.
It is not my arena at all, but they made it so easy. However, both of your guys' businesses, I would have never A, given money to, or B, known about had you guys not walked in and had this conversation and like made me privy to these really cool things that you both offer. And then bam, there you go. You came and gave me business, and then I turned around and gave it right back to both of you guys. So it can really just be that simple, you know?
Yeah, I think like a landing page, just your expectations of the buyer's journey, when you expand it to like thinking slightly longer term of like various ways that can happen, it just changes it dramatically. If like the only tool that you have to convert people is a landing page, that's like a very myopic view of how you can make your whole ecosystem work. I mean, people making the decisions, like no decision in our business is relegated to like AI quite yet in terms of like, what should we be purchasing? We don't like give an AI 5 landing pages of like, let's say we want to have an SDR do cold calling. We're like, well, this service called Casper gives you 100 numbers a month, and ListKit gives you for $300 a month, they give you 500 phone numbers. And like, we're still humans making the buying decisions. And it is a factor with ListKit, for example, that like, well, I also know Andre and I like those guys and I trust them. And so it just makes a huge difference. And some of the ways you can, again, like you said, scale the trust building process. Like, right, it's great that you and I connected through the podcasting, and Andre and like the three of us in the room at that time found ways to do things together. But also there is that kind of lateral, I don't know if lateral is quite the right word, but there is that forever existing asset that's distributed that other people are connecting with and watching. Like Andre has automations on his Twitter that retweet things after a set period of time. So he just retweeted and promoted that episode again like a week ago, because I guess it was like a year ago when he kind of announced it, and it just continues to work for you forever.
That's so cool. I think that you guys have the whole X game so dialed in. And like I said, I'm 35, so I'm just like not in on X, but you guys are like, that's how we all know each other. Like, you gotta like get in and start playing. I'm like, shoot, I am falling behind in that. But I think when it comes to content, as agency owners, as entrepreneurs, as just human beings, whoever's watching this, it gets so daunting because you already have so many other things that you do need to be doing that are like very important for being able to deliver either customer service to your client at the highest level of making sure they're satisfied, to getting new business in the door, to managing your team. There's all that kind of stuff that comes first, at least for me. And then it's like, oh shoot, I should be putting out content. And the thing that I think that podcasting does better than anything is that it holds you to a schedule that you have to stay on top of. So it's not just, oh, I'll get to it when I have time. It's like, no, I've committed. I started a show. I'm not going to build anything if I'm not showing up every week. Like I say, I'm going to show up with that new episode. So it kind of makes it to where as entrepreneurs and business owners, our feet are held kind of to the fire.
Exactly.
Versus I'll get to it when I have time. Because truthfully, like I said, I'm a perfect example. I never have time. I have 2 studios. And I'm like, I hop on other people's shows right now. But to actually stay consistent, which I could do if I just time blocked it out and, whatever. But something more important always comes up.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons that, like, we started this business of newsletters, for example, is because it was always on my list that I should start a newsletter, but something more important always popped up. And I was like, well, how many people have this exact same situation? Like, it's literally, it's just like a personal trainer. The amount of like excuses you can make for it to almost be perfect, but not quite for making content, it's just like so unbelievable. Because I go through the same thing, right? Like, my business partner has a lot of expertise in kind of the other aspects of the business. And it's like, I will schedule it on your calendar. I have the YouTube channel with a platform now to just, because if we ask the opposite question, which is like, why shouldn't I post this? Well, I don't think anyone's going to watch it. I don't think it's going to come out well. I don't know what I'm talking about. It's like, you can work through all of those objections and still come up with like some reason not to do it yet. And it's really almost like, we've gotten really consistent, or we've been really consistent. We've always prioritized getting all of our client work out on time. Mm-hmm. And it's like, should one of us just like hire us as a client to get us to produce our own content more consistently? Because it's like, that's the only way that we know how to get things done on time here. It's like, if it's a client work, then I don't know if you can kind of like relate to the same thing. It's like, if you like put in your own money as a client, then I know it'll work, because it's like, that's the system that we've optimized to like never break.
Honestly, this is the plight and the like thing that we all struggle with. And if you tell me you're a business owner, you're an entrepreneur, and you don't struggle with this, you are bold-faced lying to me right now, because we always are going to have those things. And I mean, yeah, I agree. It's like, can we just put ourselves in the client position? That would be the easiest path to doing this. But I mean, it's just it comes with the territory, yeah. I think. It does not diminish how important it is. I mean, we live in a digital age. How much time are you spending on your device, right? I spend way more time than I should. I'm reading the news. I'm reading newsletters. I'm scrolling through my Instagram. I'm popping into TikTok here and there. And I'm consuming all these random people's content that's not even actually that valuable most of the time. So if you're a human and you have something valuable to add to the marketplace, you should definitely put your hat in the ring. I mean, it's never going to be perfect. Even the best of the best, right? Nobody's doing it perfectly. Look at Joe Rogan's production quality. It's total crap. Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. People overthink so many parts of it. Do you have examples that come to mind of some like interesting, cool outcomes for some of the clients that you have? You don't have to like name them specifically if they're kind of anonymized stories of, again, they had a strong case for a podcast, they did it, and then some of these things actually started to materialize for them, whether it's like, hey, this person reached out, like deals, various kind of the outcomes everyone like is desiring, besides, oh, I was at the airport and everyone recognized me because I'm Joe Rogan famous now.
Okay, yeah. I think that if your goal is to start a podcast to where everybody just recognizes you and you're, a pseudo celebrity, then your structure for what you're doing needs to be very, very different. But I also think starting a podcast isn't the way to do that. You need to go do
TikTok.
Something else.
Maybe.
And then maybe start a podcast, right? Because there's like 5 of the top podcasts, and they're huge, huge names, and they were huge names before they even got started. But neither here nor there. Cool stories about people who've started, stuck with it. One of our clients, her big thing is, I want to impact people and I want to be speaking on more stages. I want to be booked all over the country. Well, guess what? Every episode she does is another example of how impacting her story is and how good she is at being able to, tell mental health stories that matter, if you will. I'm not going to like jump too far down that one. But she's been able to get on so many more stages, which to her, A, brings revenue, but B, it brings a lot of impact. We've got what do you call it? bodybuilding couple. They own a company that's really, really big, and they train other coaches to be under their umbrella. And they go out, they teach people who want to compete in being bodybuilders. Hey, this is how you do it. Bikini competitions, bodybuilding. Sorry, might have mixed that up a little bit. But now they've got such a presence. They're a top 50 show in fitness in the United States. They started in February. They've got sponsors, so they're making money through sponsorship. They're monetized on YouTube, and they're bringing in more coaches who are a part of their program, and thus they're impacting more people, which is bringing in more clientele. So complete full circle of being really, really effective. I will say, when you think about content, some content's going to do really well and it's going to grow a lot faster, and other types really isn't. So your top genres are health, fitness, business/money, true crime, comedy, and like wellness in general. And if you fall outside of those things, right, like marketing is important, but it's niche. Not everybody cares about marketing. You're not going to have
sometimes.
You're not going to have quite that same level of reach. But that's okay.
I think what's really interesting about those examples is they both kind of tell the same story, which is, you know, I get a lot of like young people reaching out to me for career advice often. And I usually, one of the things I like to tell them is like, do the job before you have the job kind of thing. And I don't always like remember it. That I'm often very chaotic on those calls. And then I'm like, was that helpful? Or did I just like throw this person deeper into confusion and overwhelm? I always kind of have that in the back of my mind. But one thing you tell them to do, so this woman I was talking to the other day was like, she wants to get like a copywriting client in e-commerce. And she's like, I don't have any case studies. I was like, okay, well, go get a case study for free. She's like, what do you mean? I was like, go offer to do the thing for free for somebody, and then you'll have a case study if it goes well. And the same principle is like showing that you can do the job before you get the job. And that's what really content does on behalf of all of your clients. So with the bodybuilding couple, for example, like what do people want to know from them, that like these people, why would they buy something from them? To like, well, I want to learn how to, if they're, you know, let's just say they're bodybuilders, for example, it's a bit more straightforward. Like I want to get more fit, and like I'd hire this person to get me more fit than I would on my own. Then they go demonstrate their ability to teach that for free on the podcast. Then you're like, oh, this person actually understands that. Same thing, this woman wants speaking gigs. It's like, okay, I just watched her speaking gigs. Like I know she's good. Versus again, your landing page is just you telling people, look, I'm good at this thing, versus your content is you demonstrating. And it's same thing over an email or a social post, whatever. It's like you could say we're experts at this and then no one's going to believe you, versus you consistently show up and just embody expertise and be an expert and demonstrate it. Then people are like, oh. And again, it's about, that leads to people making conclusions on their own, which just makes life much easier.
Well, it goes back to the easy one, show, don't tell, right? So if I own a podcast studio and I don't have any clients, well, then we need to make a show and like showcase that, hey, we do know how to produce high quality content, right? Now we do have such a good base. So we have so much that we can show that we don't have to just have a really fancy landing page saying, oh, this is all the stuff that we do. This is how we can do it for you. It's like, no, you don't believe me. Here's 85 examples. And we're the #1 studio in Arizona for a reason, right? So I completely agree with your sentiments. That's such good advice of, hey, go write a couple landing pages. And with our bikini/bodybuilding clients, they are experts. They know the ins and outs of the industry, and they're sharing all of that insight with their listeners for free. If you read the comments on these YouTube videos, people are like so grateful. They cannot get enough because it's value add on value add on value add. And that leads to a massive amount of client acquisition for them.
Yeah, I think 2 comments there. I don't know if it's like mathematically studied or not. Like I've heard on Amazon that on average there's 1 review for like every 10 people who buy the book or something. So you can like estimate how many copies were sold based on how many reviews. And same thing with comments. There's like all these different factors for like different layers of what percentage of people actually do something. So like I published an episode today. It was actually, so I don't know what today's the 30th, 31st. And I published the last episode of what was the Lewis and Kyle show today, kind of saying like it's the finale, we're shutting things down and we're rebranding it to what the show is now, like Orbit Radio. And I got like 2 or 3 text messages about that already. Like people texting saying they listen. And if you're getting 3 texts, you're getting 3 comments on your video saying this is great, then there's usually at least 10 times as many people who like watched it, thought it was good, but not like so much so that they felt like compelled. To take the next step and actually message you. So there's so much hidden reach to these things that's just kind of quietly accumulating and like snowballing. Or if like you think of like boiling water, it's like so many of these people were at like 210 degrees and just you're slowly getting them there. And then 6 months later, you say that, and this is the other comment I was going to make, is out of this whole podcast, someone's going to find this useful if there's one thing that they learn and take away that they want to go out and try and do. If like there's one thing we catalyze someone, like I've had this one thing in drafts for 3 weeks, and this is like the motivation to go push that thing over the finish line and publish it. Like that's what the bar is for something to be good enough to be impactful, someone to like thank you for it. And it's like with a lot of newsletters that we send, there's like 20 links. It's like, it's not, they don't need to all be 20 good for like every person. So if I read one story that was useful or interesting or taught me something, I think this was worth my time. So the bar is just, there's so many imaginary ways. It has to be perfect. Every piece of it has to be useful. I can't make one stutter and it all falls apart. It's like, no, like if it's mildly, not even mildly, if it is useful in some concrete way to one person in one way, then it was probably worth your time producing it.
I totally agree with you. I think what a lot of people, especially business owners and entrepreneurs, they don't want to get on the content train just because it feels daunting. It feels like, well, do I even know what I'm talking about? What am I going to talk about? What's interesting to people, right? Where do I get started? And that's why it's really good to have people like us, for example, who you can come in and be like, here's everything we do. And then it's like, well, let's create a strategy. Let's create some angles. And what is the end goal here, right? I went to high school with Alex Hormozy, and he's like huge in the content game. Didn't believe in it at all until he read something about Kylie Jenner being super duper rich and being 21 or something like that. And he's like, okay, well, that was all through the fact that she's got all of this content out there, right? And now him and his wife have blown up their businesses. And I think they're perfect case studies of, hey, test stuff. If you watch his videos from when he first started to where he's at now, they're completely different. If you watch the episodes for our oldest clients to the episodes that we're putting out now, oh my God, night and day. They were not great, and now they're much better. And I'm sure in a year from now, they're going to continue to get better, but you just got to get started. And I think a lot of us end up in analysis paralysis to where we're just like, but how, but when?
Yeah, I was on a sales call yesterday. This guy was like, I don't think I have anything to talk about for newsletter. And we're running this offer right now where we're doing like a free sample. So someone hops on like a 15-minute scoping call to give us enough. I'm not going to make a sample for you if you're not going to show enough investment to like tell me what you might want, right? Because I don't think there's going to be a high conversion rate on that. But if you're willing to show up for 15 minutes, understand what we do, and then you still want to move forward with the sample with no strings attached, I'm also not going to be successful if you don't tell me what you want. He's like, I don't think I like have anything to talk about. And then I asked like 2 questions of like, well, what if we talk about this, this, and this? He's like, no, don't talk about that. Talk about, and then like went on like a 5-minute rant, which I'm like, you literally gave me the next 8 months of topics, like off the top of it. Like people think they just don't have this appreciation for what they actually know. And it's often just by giving them something like even like one half step of like, well, what if we talked to, so he also has a digital marketing agency, mostly for like local businesses, chiropractors, that kind of thing. I was like, well, what if we talked about, I don't know, Google My Business. He's like, no, that's, and then he like went on some whole rant about like, that's dead. This is the new thing. And like, here's 900 other things you need to know. I was like, okay, well, you have the expertise with it. Like if you've managed to be in business and have clients and they don't fire you, it's like you've done something for them that is useful to a group of people based on some knowledge that you or someone on your team has. And that is properly enough to, like if all the people on your CRM knew you had all that knowledge and you started to trickle some of it to them through a podcast, through a newsletter, through posting on social, like something good's going to happen.
So I think a really, really good combination for a business owner, for an entrepreneur is, hey, start a podcast, but also start a newsletter. And that's not to just promote both of our businesses here. It's that it's a really effective way of making sure that your podcast is getting that reach while also adding a lot of other value to your audience through the newsletter component, because your podcast will be a portion of that newsletter. It will not be the entire newsletter. So it doesn't come across as self-promotional, because the way that you guys do it, you have so much value that's industry relevant to whoever the audience is.
Yeah, we had a client the other day and I had a catch-up call with him to record a testimonial actually. And he's like, yeah, I hired this other agency and they were making all these YouTube videos for us. I'm like, that's amazing. Like, if I'd known about that, I would have been promoting those videos in the newsletter this whole time too. Because it's like, you don't know who you're finding where. Some people find you out, randomly read one newsletter, but they actually don't ever read newsletters. Like they're just not an email consumer. It's like you're going to lose that person. But then they find out about your YouTube channel, and then who cares that they never read the newsletter again? Because they're just not everyone does everything. Some people just don't watch YouTube ever, but they'll read all your emails. And so it's like, even with my podcast that I had before this show, like I always think about like older relatives from like when I only posted on Instagram at first, I had like all these cousins and aunts and like, let's say like 50, 60, 70s, and they didn't even know I had it. Then like had an email list, sent it to one, they forwarded it to the rest of them. And then they were all like listening to every episode for weeks. It's just, you just don't know where you're going to reach people. So for us, it makes us so excited. It's not necessary, but if we come in with a client, they're like, we're already doing this form of content, but we also want to add email. It's like amazing. One, we already know topics that are proven, and two, we're actually going to make that other stuff more effective. It just compounds very quickly.
It really does. I think when you start off with a new client, that's got to be a number one question. What other things are you guys already doing so that we're already plugging and playing? And you make such a good point. Dan Coe, for example, mutual like person between me and you, I read his newsletters probably 8 out of 10 times. I never watch his YouTube videos, literally ever. I don't follow his social. I see his LinkedIn post, but I don't see any of his Instagram posts for the algorithm. Who knows? And when I'm traveling, I'll listen to some of his podcasts, right? So I'm getting different pieces of what he's putting out there in different mediums all of the time. And I think that's the other thing. Sometimes it's situational. Someone doesn't really care about reading because they're in the midst of just getting on with their day, but they're going to listen to that content that you put out. And it's nice when there's a little bit of cohesion amongst everything that you've got in your marketing ecosystem for your business.
One question that I've heard Dan mention a lot of times, and also Dickie Bush, and so we've mentioned both of them, is, I don't know if it's a question, it's a tip they give for people, because both of their brands, a lot of them, like what we're doing here, is kind of sharing the benefits of producing content for businesses, for individuals, etc. And the question of like, what do I talk about, is just, well, what advice do you have to yourself 2 years ago? Because then you get over imposter syndrome, because imposter syndrome is usually not a bad thing. It's like you saying, I'm trying to like be dishonest. I'm trying to pretend to be someone I'm not. And that usually is not going to resonate. But when you're saying, this is something I wish I knew 2 years ago, you're telling the truth. And like, then you're suddenly confident saying this, because you're like, yes, I just like really wish that I knew this 2 years ago. And that can be like the endless prompt, right? What do I wish I knew at this stage? What do I wish I knew before I did this? So one, that's just a tip for anyone listening to this. If it's like, you don't have to start a newsletter, you don't have to start a podcast. Simple way to start is like, just put out a LinkedIn post, and your prompt is, what is something I wish I knew 2 years ago? That could be personally, in my business, etc. But that's also just a question I'll pose to you. It's like, what are some things, either again, about content, about business, about life, that you wish you had known 2 years ago that would have been super helpful at the time?
2 years ago, I wish I was being really cheap about everything. And when it came to the studio, I was like penny pinching of like every little corner I could, because we were, really starting to get it churning. And I had this like fear-based mindset, I guess, for a little bit of like, oh gosh, what if it all just like fails? And we've put thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars into all this stuff, and then it's useless. Really dumb mindset now that I'm thinking about it. But I wish I had not felt that way. I wish I would have just been like, let's bet big, right? Like, let's put 1,000 on red and like hope that it hits. Just have that kind of gambler mentality, because you have to bet on yourself. And I feel like I was kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, even though we were doing it. So a little bit more confidence 2 years ago would have been great. We'd probably be a lot further along than we are now. And then number two is systems and processes, investing more into making those easier. I just redid like 10 of our podcast processes last week. We hit a really annoying point, and I was like, this is gone. This is how we're doing this. And I just ran through it. And it's not something that I'm responsible for on the team to actually be doing in the day-to-day. But it was like sometimes revisiting and seeing that, hey, this is kind of a waste of time, or too many people are touching this. Let's do this a little bit smarter. That would have been good. And then number three is like, goes back to number one, just go bigger, right? Like whatever you're thinking in that moment, just try to figure out how you can 10x that. And so instead of taking that 1x step, what would be the 10x step of that? And are you able to make that jump? Because that's the kind of stuff that's going to magnify the growth factor and the speed. And speed is everything. Success loves speed. So when you hit that momentum point, that's not the time to hit the brakes. It's like, keep going, because there's going to be that natural ebb and flow. You and I talked about it before we started, where things are going, and then they kind of slow down, and you're like, uh-oh, is everything okay? But that's natural. So to also not freak out about those moments, which I tend to do.
What are some of the bets you're placing right now?
I would really like to be able to expand our presence out to Dallas, Texas. I did try that about a year and a half ago, and the commercial real estate market just was not amenable to what we were looking for. And so I don't want to give up on that because Dallas is an excellent business environment and there's tons of people just like there is in Scottsdale who are out there doing the things. They're young, they're interesting, and that would be a next top goal. And then number 2, really simple, I just want us to be 10x better at everything we're currently offering. I think 2 years ago, to go back to that one, I was doing too much in the sense of we weren't quite as focused. So if you've got 3 different business ideas, really pick the best one and just go hard in it. Don't try to be too diversified. There's so many good ideas. Don't fall into the good idea trap.
I think those were all really great tips. It's like, again, there's so many things that people have these beliefs and they don't challenge them. It's like, I don't know what to talk about. I don't have anything useful to say. Not saying you have those beliefs at all, but like you give someone one little like nugget of, well, what if you talked about this? Like, oh, and then each one of those things, right, can become its own, any other form of content. You could probably expand on that in terms of like each of those is like a longer form idea. You could expand on, what went wrong. Just from there, it's like, what went wrong? The first time you try to go to Dallas, and then like, what are you going to try to do differently? And like, that's a whole expose. There's another episode we did this is the 3rd episode I'm recording for Orbit Radio. And this guy has a kind of like micro private equity fund. So he buys small internet companies and tries to grow them. And what he did for his content was just share their deal notes for like all the investments they're about to make or past ones and like what went wrong. And just even sharing mistakes you made like very openly is just one of the best ways you can build trust with people. Cause it's like, oh, I'm a real person. I'm not going to like, they just don't think you're as likely to lie and misrepresent yourself if you're willing to share like things that went wrong. So it's like, I'm trying to think of something that went wrong recently to like share the example. Lots of things. I'm sure.
No, I think that people love to see the failure stories too, right? Because it's not all just like glowy what you see on the Instagram feed, if you will. And I think that creates that authentic, genuine connection with the host of the podcast or the person who's behind the camera putting out the content on LinkedIn, YouTube, or in the newsletter. When you're able to just be honest and raw about those things, there's such a higher level impact versus just like good news all day, every day. And it takes people along a journey, which I think is really important.
I think, the other part of that too is even when you said, when we first started our equipment, we kind of were not cutting corners, but like looking to save money on equipment and things. And you're like, you look back on the content, it's not as good as it is now. It's like people hear that. It's like, okay, now you've seen bad content and now you know what good content is. So you have like a deeper appreciation for how to do it right. Like all of those, playing less games is just.
Yeah. It's like, if it's going to cost me $10,000 in equipment to be able to save, 5 hours per episode that we're recording in terms of what our editors are getting, and it's going to create a much better product, well, then it's definitely worth me spending that, even though it really hurts in the moment to spend $10,000 on one piece of equipment, which is an example of, hey, should we just do everything natively on each camera and then piecemeal it all together and hope that the editor is paying enough attention to, hit all the right notes? Or should we actually have someone sitting in a seat in the studio, A, B, C camming, cutting live, so that when it does get into the next level of production, you're getting something that's so much better than it would have been the first way of doing it. And the first way of doing it that I just explained is what we were doing. And now I've got more team members, right? That's expense. You've got to pay people. We've got way more technology, but all of those things lead to a much higher output in terms of quality. And it helps us get it done faster. So the quantity is going up. And whatever we're putting out there is basically our business card. So exactly. That's what everybody else is seeing. That's why when we were doing this, I said, we're not doing it virtually. You've got to come in.
Exactly.
If we have a studio, let's sit down and have a conversation.
I think it speaks to, it's planning for success, not planning for failure. And then also, even in terms of like why you mentioned your annual contracts, it's setting realistic expectations, and it's understanding that great things can happen when you put especially if you already have some form of reach. Let's say you have 10,000 followers on LinkedIn, you put out a podcast, it's going to get some reception right away. But communicating to people like this is a process where, again, if you're at a point in your business where you're only able to think about like getting the next sale, thinking about tomorrow, then you're not going to be able to enjoy some of the things that happen when you're able to step back and think 12 months ahead. Like 6 months from now, are we going to wish we'd been sending a newsletter every single week for 6 months? Because the benefit comes from having had the consistency and like the slow build and like the boiling of the water, because you can't just like flash boil, if that's even a term. And it's the same thing. And likewise, like when we actually have now spent you have people coming in, let's say 5 times a day, 5 days a week, and it's twice as efficient because you have this equipment. And if you can think 6 months ahead and do the math, you're like, oh my goodness, we're in a completely different ballpark.
Completely. Another thing too, if you're getting into content, you're figuring out what is my angle, how am I going to adequately do this, and it's more personal brand based. A big thing that I was always afraid of was to truly be myself and to be honest of, hey, I am a Christian, I am a conservative, and I believe in capitalism. And those are my core values as a human being, as a business owner, as a friend, colleague, anything, right? It was like, oh no, but what if that person doesn't like that, right? Like, you are not going to be everybody's cup of tea. There's always going to be people who just genuinely don't like your content, don't like what you have to say, and those aren't your people, and that's really okay. I think that you men do such a better job of being like, whatever, like, doesn't really matter to me. But ladies, if any of you guys are watching this, I know it's tough. We want to be liked by everyone, and that's just not realistic. So don't be afraid to just be yourself, because if you start off as who you are, then you're never going to feel like you're showing up and you're putting out fake content. I read an article recently about a bunch of YouTubers who are quitting because they feel like they're putting a fake facade on. I think Dan Coe actually did an entire post or an email about this too, about why YouTubers are quitting. And they're like, I just feel like I'm inauthentic. And at the end of the day, if you feel that way, well, you're the only one to blame, right? Don't put out content that's not genuinely who you are or what you believe, and you're not going to find yourself in that position.
Yeah. It's difficult to, anything that's really painful to do, you're just not going to stay with forever. And so what creates the pain? And if being authentic creates the pain, then you'll stop because if it's that, if it's the actual work involved of like editing, like when I first started my podcast and I was in college and I didn't have any income and I was editing myself, like that got really old very quickly. And like, I'm glad I made it over, but that could have been the end of it right there. Like if I had to write our newsletter every single week, in addition to all my other responsibilities, like that could be it. But it's certainly like, having to look in the mirror and being like, I don't like what I'm doing, like that also takes a serious toll.
Well, it's just like anything. You have to put in the reps. You got to put in the hours. If you had to edit and do it, and you had to be the jack of all trades in that situation. There's been so many moments in my business where I've had to do a lot of the exact same things. But then if you stick with it, you're going to get to a point where, hey, this expertise I built up has paid off. I can now put someone else who's better suited to be a player in this position into that spot. And if you work for a company, right? Like, for example, my producer here, Ethan, he's great. From when he started to where he's at now, he worked at a different studio before he came to us. He's learned so much more because the way we do things is so different than what he came from, right? So his skill set continues to enhance. And say he goes off and moves to Texas and wants to open up his own studio. Well, he's got that skill set now because he put in the reps and the time to really learn how to do those things. But you know, at first, everything's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. It's going to be tedious. It's going to be really annoying. But if you continue on, you'll get to that point where you're like, okay, you're going to do the newsletter. You're going to do the editing. You're going to do this. You're going to do the booking. You're going to make sure all the show notes are done. Great. I'm just going to show up, be the talent, and get out of here.
Exactly. You mentioned having to step in the chair sometimes yourself. What have been some of the favorite things to step into the producer chair, like be the person listening to the conversation and monitoring the cameras, making sure it's all working? What have been some of the things that have been your favorite kind of, that's like all the accidental stuff, right? That's unplanned. That's you're learning in a way, like you're just here to, you told someone, I sold you the studio for the hour. I'm just going to make sure the camera is rolling, but you get the added benefit of like listening to two interesting people talk. What have been some of the favorite things that you've accidentally learned from just being a podcast producer on the side?
Oh my gosh, so many fascinating things. What's the number one is these stories of adversity. All these successful people that our hosts are interviewing, I mean, they didn't just wake up that way. And I think that right now in the glorified social media world that we live in, everybody looks at you and they're like, oh, well, you've always just like had money, or you've always been successful. You've always had a booming business. And it's like, no, absolutely not.
You don't miss, right? It's like this person doesn't miss.
No, exactly. And like, for example, I have a cousin who listened to my interview on Robert Kiyosaki's show, and she goes, I had no idea you had $88,000 of student loans. I thought your dad just paid for everything and whatever. I'm like, well, it's not something that I went around like advertising like, hey, guess what? I'm in $88,000 of debt, right? But I'm happy to be honest and authentic in my story to tell people that like, hey, it freaking sucked. And if I were to go back, I'd do it differently, but I can't go back. But here's what I've learned through that. And so those types of stories throughout, I have loved your interview with Andre, one of my favorites, because he was like, this is the power of podcasting. It's not about monetization. It's about connection. It's about, hey, now I'm a lot more likely to do business with you because I understand you and I like you. Those two tenets. Dan Coe, another excellent guest. He always is sharing just I mean, he's so deep in his head. It's crazy that this guy can sit down on camera and then get all of that out. Do you know what I mean? What a talent. And you guys are all so young. It's really, I love to see the younger generation stepping up to the plate, sharing the story to then continue to inspire, especially in this date of comparison, right?
Yeah. The episode I did with Dan, I had Kyle there too, so that certainly helped. That was the only one I've done like in person with no notes, no outline. Like I just showed up and just talked, and so did he. And that was a cool experience. And I credit a lot of that to him being like having the ideas and me just having to have like a couple of questions.
He's genuinely like a low-key genius. There's so much to learn from him. He came in, I ended up behind the camera that one day too. It was like all you guys always book late in the afternoon and everybody's kind of gone and it's last minute. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll be the one here. So Dan was talking about he was doing these sprint things, right? And I was like, that sounds fascinating. I think it was like $50. I was like, I'll go sign up. Once again, he shows up. You guys are giving us money to produce. And then bam, I become the consumer because I'm inspired enough after hearing a really compelling story. So obviously I'm the producer seat, but our audience is hearing that too, right? They're saying, hey, I could really use that service, or I could really use that like next piece in my journey to creating a stronger, better business. Well, I already know I like these two because I just sat there and I listened to their interview and they seem pretty nice and genuine. Well, you're a lot more likely to do business versus that cold, like you said, landing page where it's, I'm telling you what I do, but I'm not showing you what I do.
Yeah. Well, it's just graduating to better, like it's a better form of sales in the sense that it's more effective, but it's less predictable and it's less, you can't force it to happen. But he's just sitting there telling a story. It's just, again, it's just real. Like, I'm Dan, I was doing this thing, it was really cool. This was a part of it that was involved, and this was the great outcome. Anyway, moving on. And like, that's it. And then you're listening to that and you're like, I want that, I'm gonna buy that. And like that, no part of that was intended to drive a sale. It's about helping people come to a natural conclusion. And we're really fortunate that we have these new mediums of distribution that are accessible to anybody, where like I say always sometimes, if you stop and zoom out and like think about how absurd some of these like capabilities are, it's like, how did people used to make decisions and get information from people? And now we're just fortunate enough to like to be able to package and distribute that without needing to like, again, people can hire you for a lot less. They can build their own studio, right? And they can distribute all these things and have this impact. And it's just basically saying like the timeless way of just humans communicating, sharing things, and people listening to people they respect and then wanting to emulate the parts of that they like. It's like, okay, how do we reproduce that and distribute it at scale? And it's by producing content.
It really is. There's a movie that every business owner should watch. It's the story of BlackBerry. I don't know if you saw that documentary. It's not a documentary. It's like whatever. There's real actors in it. But it's fascinating because back in those days, they didn't have all this stuff at their fingertips, right? You're young, so you probably didn't have a BlackBerry. You probably started with the iPhone. But
I just like played games on my parents' BlackBerry.
So the rest of us, we had BlackBerries. And BlackBerries, you could barely take a picture, but you could communicate quickly, right? It was the first time you could do that without being charged per text, which was the wave even more before your generation. But this movie is great because it shows if you want to do business with someone, you physically have to go buy a plane ticket and then get to that person's city and then take a taxi to get to that person's office and then try and pitch them in person in order to do that. With the wave of technology we're in, we've removed all of those barriers. You no longer have to spend $500 to go and hop on a plane to get that client in New York City. The clients in New York City probably would have never hired a company out of Scottsdale, Arizona because it's so inconvenient, right? But now there's no barriers. We can do business globally in a snap of a finger. And it's a really, really good time for people to realize that this is all something that you can control, right? You're starting off in a nice, tiny little ball, but you can expand that so quickly. And you're a great example. How long have you had your old show?
I've been podcasting since March of 2020.
Okay. So we're going on almost 5 years, and you've seen tremendous success. Right? What was your story? You guys had like 1,000 subscribers or like a couple hundred subscribers, and then all of a sudden it just like skyrocketed?
We got a lot of subscribers on YouTube from a couple of shorts.
Okay.
That just really amplified. It was like under 1,000 subscribers for 3 years. Then it went from 1,000 subscribers to 10,000 within like 3 to 5 months, mostly from short form.
See, but you could have never predicted that.
No.
Right? You would have thought the long form, really good, hard-hitting interviews would have been the spike in the equation, and it was the short stuff.
But again, same thing. We almost treated it, again, not to get lost in the metrics. Like for us, when we started the podcast, it was genuinely we're young, we're in college, we don't know what we want to do with our careers. We don't have like business mentors accessible to us in any particular way. And so for us, like a conversion was a real relationship forming with like a business mentor. Like that would be, if we didn't have a product to sell, the product was just like, we want to have more successful people, more direct access to successful people than like we have in our little local bubble of like this college town. And that like the metrics were just the size. So it's like, yeah, this podcast didn't have 1,000 subscribers for like 3 years, but in that same time, we'd met all these incredible people, and it led to, Kyle's first and second job and my first and second job. And like all of these, those were the conversions that were the outcomes that we were trying to drive. And so like the views are just such an unimportant, like our best case study, our most impactful case study we have for the business, this guy who said, his newsletter, he already credits us for like 100 grand in revenue from it. That list had 150 people on it. It's like, at 150 people on it, but he knew exactly who wanted on his list. They were all decision makers in his industry that he had some loose connection with in the past, but never fully converted. We sent them a short weekly newsletter for and that was over like a 12-week period. The only reason he like paused the services is because it's a very seasonal business. So he's like, everything's on pause for now. But he's like, next season, which is coming up in a couple months, it's like the music industry. So it's all festivals that he sells, or like music festivals. Cool. But it's like you put all these operators on there. They're like, this guy gets it, right? He gets the industry. He understands us. He's young. He's cool. It's one of those very like mimetic, like you got to be hip. You got to know what's going on. And he like demonstrated that with the newsletter. And then they're like, oh, let's book a call and get this happening. And so it's like 150 people. Like I really on a sales call, if someone has under 1,000 people, I'm kind of like, oh, we should find a way to get 1,000 people on the list. But also like our best case study is it's about who's watching it, not how many.
I think it just goes to show if you put the effort and the intention out there, crazy good things can happen. There's not a specific threshold, right? We've got clients who start podcasts. We've just started one actually last week. He has like 150 people maybe on his Instagram, but his content is so good. I know he's going to be a top health podcast within a year. Like there's no doubt in my mind. He started with a fully sponsored show because the people in his inner circle believe in him and the content he's putting out so much that bam, right off the bat, he's got sponsors locked in on launch day. I mean, there's no specific playbook, I guess. There's just some good advice that we're just trying to share with people to be like, hey,
just do something.
Do something.
Get in motion. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. You're here in Scottsdale at the studio for anyone who wants to record an in-person podcast.
psstudios.co.
If you're in town and want to just, like, Andre doesn't live here. I found out he was in town, and I was like, hey, while you're in town, let's record this podcast at the studio, because he doesn't do online.
Yeah, he doesn't do online. So I love him for that, by the way.
It worked out great. And then the business is also same website, same LinkedIn.
pscreative.co.
Amazing.
Yeah, but you can find them all easily, same places.
Perfect. Well, this has been a blast. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.